I'm Gary Lawson. I'm the Associate Dean for Intellectual Life. And on behalf of Boston University School of Law, I'd like to welcome everyone to this extremely important panel on the effects of 9/11 on legal developments over the last 2 decades. Within a few years, a substantial percentage of the students at this law school will not have been alive on September 11th, 2001. That makes events like this all the more important. So with that, I'm going to turn proceedings over to Anita Crawford, the chair of the Political Science Department here at Boston University, who will be the moderator for today's panel. Again, thank you all for participating in this event.
Well, greetings everyone in person and virtually. What we have today are 3 experts in their fields, Sarah Sherman-Stokes, Catherine Matrano, and Sahar Aziz. And what I wanted to do is just quickly say something about them, but then have them in their remarks say why they in particular are qualified, have a good perspective for us. So Sarah is Associate Director of the Immigrant Rights and Human Trafficking Program here. Catherine Matrano is Senior Counsel to the General Counsel of the Department of Veterans Affairs. And she's served in the same role in the Department of Homeland Security when it was first established. And I want to talk to her about the budget of Homeland Security at some point. And then Sahar Aziz is the Clay Visiting Professor of International Law, but she's also a faculty member at Rutgers Law School. So if we could each take about 10 minutes, and we'll start with Sarah.
Thank you so much, Nita, and thank you, Gary. Can everybody hear me? Yes? Okay, great. Still getting used to this behind the mask situation. Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. As Professor Crawford said, I'm the Associate Director of the Immigrants' Rights and Human Trafficking Program here at the law school, and I also teach immigration law. I'm not sure that I am qualified to be on this panel, but I'm going to do my best to prove that I am. But really, I'm here to talk about the lasting impact on immigration policy that 9/11 has had. And by that, I mean the impact on both immigration law writ large, also on surveillance, detention, deportation, racial profiling, just to name a few. But before I start, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the many immigrants who lost their lives on 9/11. They were cooks, delivery workers, window washers, firefighters, and stock traders. An estimated 67 undocumented immigrants, mainly from Mexico and Central America, who worked at the World Trade Center are still considered missing 2 decades after the attacks. Many families of undocumented folks were fearful of coming forward to claim their loved ones or to let anyone know that their loved ones were missing because they were fearful of enforcement impacting themselves, their families, and their communities. They were not able to recover from the compensation fund, let alone properly grieve the death of their family member. The horrific events of September 11th forever altered US immigration policy. Just days before September 11th, 2001, then President of the United States, George W. Bush, and then President of Mexico, Vicente Fox, were actively discussing a path to citizenship for more than 3 million undocumented Mexican citizens that were then living in the United States. In fact, testimony in support of this legislation was scheduled for the next day, September 12th, 2001. Perhaps not surprisingly, after September 11th, immigration and terrorism became nearly synonymous, such that any path towards citizenship was quickly ruled out. There's so much I could talk about, but today I want to focus in my remarks on 3 things. I'm briefly going to talk about the ways in which the immigration agency itself changed, although I suspect that my co-panelist Kathy is going to talk much more about that. I'm secondly going to talk about what this meant and continues to mean for non-citizens and communities of color. And I'm going to close by talking about resistance, and that's intentional. Because alongside growing enforcement and a growing carceral state, we have also seen incredible acts of solidarity, immigrant organizing, and resistance that have pushed back against this regime, in many cases successfully. So to start, I'm going to talk about reorganization, because in direct response to the events of September 11th, Congress passed the Homeland Security Act of 2002. This act led to the dramatic reshuffling of the immigration enforcement apparatus. 22 federal agencies were brought under the ambit of the Department of Homeland Security. And its name is important, right? Department of Homeland Security. It suggests that there is a homeland, it's here, and we have to protect it, right? We have to protect it from the threat of the foreign born. We have to protect it from foreign invaders that might do us harm. And of course, with the creation of the Department of Homeland Security came a flood of federal funding. Approximately $589 billion went toward DHS just between 2002 and 2011. That's not even to say what's happened in the 10 years since. What has this reorganization meant for non-citizens and communities of color? This increased funding, this reorganization, meant that we had a renewed focus on removing and excluding non-citizens who we thought to be a threat, non-citizens who we believed would be criminals or terrorists. This began quickly with the National Security Entry-Exit Registration System, or NSEERS, a program specifically targeting Arab, Muslim, and South Asian communities for special registration through racial profiling, surveillance, and increased detention and deportation. The program ended for lack of efficiency, but not until 2011. And during its years of operation, it's worth noting that this program did not lead to a single terrorism prosecution. Instead, the discriminatory program led to more than 3,000 people being detained by the Department of Homeland Security, more than 14,000 individuals facing deportation, and more than 83,000 individuals being registered in a government database despite no indicia of a threat except for their national origin and their religion. Many Muslim men were also detained and held in secret in administrative confinement. They were brutalized, and they were made to prove that they weren't threats. That is, the presumption of innocence was flipped. It was presumed that because of who they were, not because of anything they had done, that they were a threat and a terrorist. The impact of these detentions and deportations cannot be quantified, nor can the resulting and deep-seated fear and anxiety that settled into Arab, Muslim, and South Asian communities, who were now the target of deportation, racism, and discrimination based explicitly on their race, their national origin, or their religion. At the same time, the Bush administration created a narrative around Muslims as an ever-present threat. Sure, the president paid lip service to saying that we can't discriminate against Muslim communities, but there was also narrative scaffolding around an ever-present sort of amorphous Muslim threat that was around every corner. Many of you might remember the See Something, Say Something campaign, right? We were always looking for where the next threat was going to come from. And of course, there's a through line between that kind of narrative and how it was so easily interchanged with narratives of the next president, right? President Obama, the threat was Central American asylum seekers and folks crossing the southern border. And then again, under Trump, it was Muslims, right? These narratives are interchangeable because they are amorphous. They are the other who would do us harm, and we have to prevent their entry. In addition to NSEERS, we had the USA Patriot Act, with this sort of clunky acronym, providing appropriate tools required to intercept and obstruct terrorism, the USA Patriot Act, which was approved by Congress and signed into law just 2 months after September 11th, 2001. The Patriot Act provided sweeping authority to increase surveillance and mandatory detention and deportation. And one particular provision that I want to highlight is the designation of foreign terrorist organizations that expanded under the USA Patriot Act. And it allowed the US government to designate foreign groups that they believed were terrorist, and then to exclude non-citizens on the basis of having been members of or participants in these organizations. It seems straightforward, but not really. Because when you actually get into the weeds and work with clients, as I have, that have been denied entry or removed from the United States based on their participation, it gets a little thorny. I'll give you an example of a young man that I'll call Ayan. And Ayan was a young man from Sri Lanka who was Tamil, and he was kidnapped by the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, or the LTTE, a militant separatist group that was fighting for an independent homeland for Hindu Tamils. And he was not politically active, he was just ethnically Tamil, but he was kidnapped by the LTTE and forced to perform odd jobs for them, to wash clothes, to cook food, to drive a truck. He finally escaped and made his way to the United States, where he became our client, and he sought asylum. He was immediately put in detention without the opportunity for bail, or what we call bond in immigration custody. And he was barred from obtaining asylum because he had, quote, provided material support to terrorism. The terrorist group was the LTTE, a group he wanted nothing to do with, a group that he was coerced into joining under duress. And this young man is just one of many. I think David Cole and other scholars have argued convincingly that non-citizen civil liberties have been sacrificed in favor of supposed security for the rest of us. And that was certainly the case with this young man who posed no threat. In addition to the Patriot Act, we had the Real ID Act of 2005, which significantly expanded the grounds of inadmissibility, or the grounds on which we can keep non-citizens out of this country, for supposed terrorist activity. Young men just like Ayan. Since then, we've also seen dramatic increases in border patrol, border surveillance. Surveillance domestically has grown dramatically. And there's little evidence that these costs have been justified. And I'm happy to go into any more of these programs in the Q&A. But for now, in closing, I want to turn to resistance. Because at the same time that our rights have been curtailed, and especially the rights of non-citizens and communities of color have been curtailed, and at the same time that enforcement and surveillance have grown, communities across the country have also built networks of impressive solidarity. Immigrant organizing has seen new and impressive highs, and they've been able to challenge and resist racist and discriminatory laws and excessive enforcement at the local, state, and national level. There are too many examples to share today, but I'm just going to share one. And that is an organization called DRUM, or Desi's Rising Up and Moving. They were among the first to actively resist NSEERS. And DRUM founded the New York City Coalition Against Special Registration, along with other groups, including the Prison Moratorium Project and the Coalition for the Human Rights of Immigrants. And they drew on a framing that actively pulled together themes of national security, immigrant rights, and mass incarceration. For years, they engaged in weekly vigils, legislative and policy advocacy at both the national and local level, direct support of non-citizens facing deportation, and an unrelenting drive to build power among immigrant communities who are impacted by this law. For the future law students in the room, I'll just note, our future lawyers in the room, I'll just note, they did so with lawyers, but they weren't at the behest of lawyers, right? They were working as organizers, as impacted communities, and lawyers were integral to this effort, but they were not the leaders. They were good listeners and they took good direction. And together, this is what made this a successful organizing effort. In her book, We Do This Till We Free Us, Miriam Kaba, an abolitionist organizer, reminds us that our response to harm does not have to be a cage or doing nothing at all, though these are generally the only options offered to us. Punishment, consequences, and accountability are distinct categories. We can be against punishment, we can be against cruelty, pain, and suffering, and still work toward accountability, and still work toward consequences. American exceptionalism has often meant that we react brutally to the violent acts of other people, as I would argue we did in the wake of 9/11, while ignoring the horrific acts that we ourselves have committed in the name of safety and security. Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib, family separation, mass detention. These are only some of the ones in recent memory. As Kaba writes, our charge is to make imagining liberation under oppression completely thinkable, to really push ourselves to think beyond the normal in order for us to be able to address the root causes of people's suffering. Increased enforcement, skyrocketing incarceration, increasingly militarized state violence, they will not bring us closer to repair. They will not heal the pain that we faced as individuals and a country after 9/11. This is my last story, I promise. Sekou Sikbi is an asylum seeker from Ivory Coast. He was working at Windows on the World right before 9/11, and he traded his work shift with another immigrant, Moises Rivas, a father from Ecuador. So Sekou Sikbi was not at work on 9/11. Moises Rivas was there. And Moises Rivas died that day. Sikbi turned his grief into action. He founded the Restaurant Opportunities Center United to support restaurant workers and advocate for better pay and better working conditions. Anger does not heal grief, but action can. And as conversations around policing and abolition, surveillance and enforcement grow, I would argue that now is the time, 20 years after 9/11, for us to critically reflect on our missteps, on the pain that we've inflicted, and to consider the power of real transformative justice and what it might mean to take a path that truly brings us closer to peace and security. Thank you.
Thank you. Hey, Catherine Matrano, would you like to go next?
Yes, thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today. It's a real honor to be back at my alma mater. I was in the class of 1989, so I'm probably much older than many people on the panel and in this room. I actually, can remember 9/11. I graduated in '89. I was both an undergrad political science major here back when it used to be the College of Liberal Arts, and then went on to law school in the 6-year law program. I'm not an academic. I don't have the degree of expertise or bona fides, as my colleague has said, as most of the members of this panel, but I'm someone that's worked for 7 different federal agencies and devoted my career to public service. Coming up upon 30 years of working in the federal government. I was there through 9/11. I have the experiences to speak for it, and I'd just like to share some of those with you today and offer my perspective. So on September 11, 2001 at 8:46 a.m., I was settled into a flight from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco, California, preparing to conduct depositions. Shortly thereafter, the pilot announced that we were diverting to Denver, Colorado, and that we could use our cell phones. Now, I had worked at the Federal Aviation Administration for a number of years, and I knew the significance of a pilot coming on and saying you can use your cell phones, that something unusual, very unusual was happening. He didn't provide us any other information, but frankly, I didn't wait to hear any other information. I was on my cell phone, and miraculously, I got through to my husband, Nick. As I spoke with him, he told me a plane had hit one of the Twin Towers in New York. And while we discussed and speculated that perhaps this was an accident, he shared with horror that a second plane had hit the second tower. This news, coupled with my flight's diversion to Denver and the pilot's extraordinary permission to use our cell phones, led me to rapidly conclude that we were under attack. My fellow passengers and I spent the rest of our time in the air, alert to any suspicious activity that might be going on around us in the plane. And we sighed a collective sigh of relief when we safely landed in Denver. From that day forward, I refocused my federal career on missions that would support efforts to ensure we would never again see a day like 9/11. Mine was an easy decision when the White House called and asked me to help stand up the new Department of Homeland Security in November of 2002. I was gratified to see that even as Congress and the nation reacted swiftly to the terrorist threats, we felt it was important to remember that the fiber of our nation and the rule of law is inextricably intertwined with concepts of individual freedoms and civil liberties. The balance between these lofty ideals and protection against those who seek to do us harm is often challenging to strike. Yet we must continually strive to do just this in a very thoughtful manner. The Homeland Security Act and its progeny laws and regulations have affected every facet of public policy since 9/11, and it continues to do so today. Every day, Americans now become familiar with personal restrictions and limitations that weren't necessary before September 11th. We stand in lines and dutifully hand over identification when asked at airports, and we submit to physical screening to enter public buildings. These effects are easy to see and commonly known. Yet 9/11's reach goes far deeper. In corporate America, foreign control of US companies is now subject to scrutiny, as is international supply chain monitoring. The Patriot Act, mentioned by my colleague, gave the government broad authorities to investigate money laundering and terrorist financing. The network of laws passed since 9/11 is also designed to harden our nation against cyber terrorism, bioterrorism, and attacks against our critical infrastructure. Yet, for every degree of protection we gain, some measure of personal freedom and expectation of privacy is relinquished. We as a nation must continually evaluate our values and determine our priorities. This is not easy for a nation as diverse as we are. In my 30+ years of federal career, I've seen the pendulum of public policy swing, influenced many times by threats that we face. We're seeing it right now as we face the threat of the global pandemic. We see the restrictions on our personal liberties occur in the form of vaccine mandates, of masking mandates. We're all fully masked right now. It's a restriction that we accept in order to gain the degree of safety from the pandemic. You know, you can see where the roots of that started, even in the 9/11 follow through. But this pendulum always seems to recenter to the core values that are embedded in our Constitution. This is why I believe we must continue to instill in our next set of leaders the value of our Constitution and the rule of law in our country, and to never let our desire to protect ourselves from harm cause us to relinquish the very ideals that we seek to defend. Again, thank you so much for having me here today. I really look forward to any of your questions after the panel is done.
Thank you. I'll let you know. I think you are permitted. Is this, what's the rule? Okay, you can take it off.
Just while I speak, otherwise you won't hear me. Thank you so much. So my name is Sahar Aziz. I have the distinct honor of being a visiting professor here at Boston University. You have a beautiful campus and a very positive environment. So it's something to be grateful for. I want to thank Elizabeth Clancy and Kim and Jeremy and Gary and the many others who organized this event. And I want to thank Dean Angela and Wachi Willig for everything she's done for this law school. I'm a bit biased because she's someone I've known for a long time, and you're very fortunate to have her here as a leader in your institution. So how many of you all here are 1L students? They might have class right now. Okay, so we've got 2. So I was 20 years ago. I was a first-year law student at the University of Texas in Austin. And I went to law school with a very specific purpose in mind. And some of you may have a specific purpose, or you're still exploring your interests. Mine was I wanted to work on democracy, rule of law, and civil rights and human rights in the Middle East, and especially in Egypt, which is where I was born and where my parents immigrated for many of the same reasons many immigrants immigrate, which is to seek economic opportunity and a future for their children. But when 9/11 happened, everything changed for all of us, but especially for me and my community. And I was raised in Dallas, where we had a conservative Muslim community. My mother wears the headscarf. All of her friends wear the headscarf. We attend the mosque on a regular basis. And in fact, Texas was actually, before 9/11, quite a friendly place for religious Muslims because it is a religious place. There are a lot of devout Christians there. And when 9/11 happened, suddenly the people who either didn't know that we were Muslim, or if they did, they didn't necessarily see that as a threat because there were often common moral values and common ethical values that we shared, suddenly suspected us in ways that was really traumatizing, both in your personal life, but then on the media. So with that, I ended up changing my career path. And for the last 20 years, I've been working on post 9/11 discrimination, and I would really like to be unemployed. I don't want there to be a need for what I do, but there is, for better or worse. So I want to make 3 points today in the limited time that I have. The first is that legal authorities were in fact expanded after 9/11. And it's not just in the Patriot Act that was passed in an unprecedented 45 days of so-called congressional deliberation. You can't deliberate in 45 days on a law that large. But most of the government's actions that ultimately allowed that, well, most of the government's actions targeting Muslim communities were pursuant to laws that pre-existed, that predated 9/11. I'll go into a little bit of detail about that. The second point I want to make is that the interesting question we have now that we're 20 years later is, and this is really for your generation of law students, is why did the public tolerate this lawfare, as I call it, at best, or demand it at worst? I mean, there were people, and I recall this explicitly, calling for the internment of Middle Easterners, the internment of Arabs. People were openly supportive of racial profiling, especially that first year after 9/11. And just to give a little historical context, I don't know if some of those of my generation remember the lawyers in the room, but we were this close, this country, of passing the End Racial Profiling Act, which had been a 10-year advocacy effort, led by African-American communities, because of the systemic and pervasive racial profiling endemic in policing. But 9/11 ended that. And then finally, and I'll give a little bit of introduction to a book that's published, will be published in 2 months, which is called The Racial Muslim. I want to kind of have you all think about this paradox, which is, why didn't a overtly religious minority, I don't think we're all disputing that Islam is a religion and Muslims are a religious minority, why were they so mistreated in a country that privileges and prides itself on religious freedom? Like, religious freedom is one of the multiple culture war points in our country, and it's been that way for arguably since we were founded. So that's another legal, law, and society question. So let's look a little bit about the legal authorities. And my colleague who focused on immigration law, I cited many of them. But material support to terrorism laws, they were passed under Clinton in 1996. They are the most powerful counterterrorism statute that has been used in ways that are highly politicized, meaning that if you want to provide humanitarian aid to a child or a pregnant woman or a sick person in a conflict zone, this law effectively prohibits you from doing so. Not specifically, if in that conflict zone, there is a designated terrorist group that operates there. And oftentimes in conflict zones, there are designated terrorist groups. So you cannot give charity to someone in Gaza because Hamas controls Gaza. And as a result, you could be prosecuted. And in fact, many people have. Similarly with Iraq, similarly with Yemen, similarly with Bosnia when there was a Serbian war. So anytime there's a conflict zone and there are designated terrorist groups, you as a citizen, if you hired a lawyer, they would tell you don't give charity. But but what happens if you're a Muslim and you believe that you should give charity to Muslims in need, and you don't think that it should go to only particular people? Right? What happens when there's a religious obligation, not necessarily to give money to people in Gaza, not necessarily to give to poor people in Yemen, but you believe that that is your religious right to be able to give zakat. You also have terrorist watch lists. Those predated 9/11, and you can just do a Google and you'll find that it is a very, very long list. There are hundreds of thousands of people. No one will tell you whether you're on it. You can't get off of it effectively. You can try. I used to work for the Office for Civil Rights at DHS, and that was our job. And ultimately, you get the GLOMAR response, which is we can neither deny or acknowledge that you are on this list. And the only reason you even know you're on a terrorist watch list is because every time you go to the airport, you get frisked. Or if you're really unlucky, you can't even get on the airplane because you're on a no-fly list. Suffice it to say that the vast majority of people on that list are Muslim or Middle Eastern or Pakistani or Indian or South Asian. Again, it's humiliating to be secondarily screened and not know the basis for it and not know how to get off of it. And I will tell you that I've had personally that experience in the Middle East before. And yet this is a democracy and those are authoritarian regimes. So we need to also be thinking about whether we are in fact that exceptional, right, in terms of the way that we treat our citizens or some citizens. FBI voluntary interviews. So tens of thousands. I don't know if it's reached 100,000 or more. I wouldn't be surprised if it has because it's very hard to track. People don't report this. But over the last 20 years, to be conservative, tens of thousands of Muslims, women and men, but primarily men, have had the FBI. Imagine the FBI knocks on the door and you're in the classroom or you're at work or you're at home. And they say, I'm sorry, I just need to speak with you for a minute. You don't mind? Do you have a warrant? No. Am I under arrest? No. We just need your cooperation. What would you do? Would you, and let's say that you are you have a green card or you are on a student visa. If you don't cooperate, will the FBI, are you afraid the FBI will think you've got something to hide? If you do cooperate and you manage to inadvertently make a material false statement to the federal agent, you are now subject to prosecution under 18 U.S.C. 1001, which you face up to 5 years in prison for making a false statement to a federal agent. If it's terrorism related, you get a 5-year enhancement, so you could be in jail for 8 years. But the FBI might not waste their time on you, so they'll just ask you to be an informant. And they'll ask you to either formal informant or informal, just keep an eye out. What does the imam say at the mosque? What are you hearing with these young Muslim men? Are there radicalized people in your community? We'll be back to visit you. Think about the intimidation that that brings, especially if you're an immigrant or someone who wasn't raised here and you haven't, in fact, been educated on your rights because you haven't gone to school here. And even with citizens. Also, imagine what your coworkers are thinking about you. Your name is Muhammad. Your name is Ahmed. Your name is Omar, Osama. What do your classmates think about you? What do your neighbors think about you? Are the neighbors now going to call the FBI who actually came to visit you, which there's been many, many false tips. So that was the reality that people lived in. But these weren't stories that you would hear because oftentimes they were afraid to make them public. But those of us who were working in the civil rights arena, this was the type of intake. And then finally, just a few, there's a long litany. And if you're really interested in going into the legal depths, I'll just direct you to my ssrn.com page because I've written many law review articles on counterterrorism and what I call racialized counterterrorism. But you also have two black stains, and it really is a black stain on our nation and our reputation, which are the torture memos in Guantanamo Bay. We're a democracy, right? I just got off a panel about human rights in the Middle East, where regimes torture, but so does ours. And what was worse is that it was legitimized through law, that the standard was anything short of death or organ failure. And so waterboarding was considered legal. I mean, I'm not going to go into John Yoo and the torture memos and Alberto Gonzalez. Were they prosecuted? No. Were any of the lawyers prosecuted? No. So not only did we torture, we also didn't hold people accountable. And Guantanamo Bay is still open, and Obama tried to close it. Congress refused because they didn't want to try them in federal court because that was what we were going to do. We weren't going to let them go free. And the problem was we have rules of evidence, and rules of evidence will not accept evidence that is arising out of torture. And many of these individuals, that's the evidence we had against them, was based on torture. Okay, so that just paints somewhat of a bleak picture, but I want, when I'm at law, as a law professor and someone who studies the Middle East and authoritarian regimes, one of my main objectives is to tell American law students that we are not exceptional in this country. And the reason why that's important is not to make you feel bad, but it is to make you feel responsible. That the reason why ultimately the torture memos were disclosed and ultimately at least the laws were changed in terms of waterboarding is in reverse, the memo is reversed, was because of civil rights and civil liberties advocates and investigative journalists and civil society and watchdogs, which hopefully, some of you will do as a career choice. Okay, so then the question is, why did we tolerate it and why did some of us demand it in our society? Here's where I'm going to put my critical race theory hat on. And yes, I'm one of those people that is under attack nationwide. There's a group of us. 10 years ago, nobody knew what critical race theory was. This is where the legacy of xenophobia, anti-Black racism, and imperialism, right, converge, is that we do have systems that may facially be neutral, but in implementation, in enforcement, are anything but neutral along racial, religious, gender lines and immigrant lines, immigration status lines. And so we need to continue to explore. I mean, counterterrorism is where I've been exploring these questions. But what happened, one of the phenomena that was even more, it was perverse, but one of the phenomena that happened post 9/11 was a convergence of anti-Black racism and Islamophobia when Obama became elected. And I don't know how many of you all are privy to this, but if you've heard of the birther movement, that was an anti-Black racist movement. It was against Obama, but why were they questioning whether he was born in America? That is not a common challenge that African Americans face. That's a common challenge that immigrants face. Right? Are you really a citizen? Did you lie on your naturalization papers? Did you violate any immigration laws? Because of his Kenyan Muslim father who didn't raise him. I mean, he was estranged. And so really what they were saying is this guy's a secret Muslim who got elected, and he's going to go into the White House and he's going to help the Islamic extremists, the terrorists, come in and invade the country from within. And this is a plot that is going to destroy the country. And what you want to say, what you want to respond to say, that's crazy and fringe and hopefully in some little corner in a box somewhere. But unfortunately, it was mainstreamed. And one of the biggest propagandist on this movement was no one other than Donald Trump. And he was elected our president. And then 70 or 73 million people voted for him for a second term. So we need to ask ourselves, rather than be upset at Trump, ask ourselves, what does this say about our country? And then I'm not going to be able to get to the racial paradox, but I'll just end with two polls. Right? Lawyers care about facts. In 2017, this was a Pew Research poll. And the question was, are you very or somewhat concerned about extremism in the name of Islam around the world? And we had 82% say yes. There was another poll about favorability of Muslims, and I think it was 42% of Americans had a low favorability of Muslims as compared to in the 70th or high 60th percentile for Christians and Jews, or Protestants and Jews. If you look back 100 years ago, the Jews were at the bottom. That's how rampant anti-Semitism was in the early 20th century, which is what my book is essentially about, is comparing anti-Semitism, anti-Catholicism with Islamophobia. 2021, just recently, the Associated Press and Center for Public Affairs Research conducted ahead of the 9/11 anniversary found that 53% of Americans have unfavorable views towards Islam, compared with 42% who have favorable ones. When I saw this, I was very sad because it's been 20 years and I've been waiting and waiting for these numbers to go down, and they're not going down. And if 53% of Americans hold unfavorable views to Islam, that means that's going to affect how they treat Muslims at work, in public, in school. Think about the children that are being bullied. There's a lot to talk about there. So I'll just end with three kind of points. First, the three lessons. The rule of law, equality, and civil rights exist because we, all of us, especially you as future lawyers, the residents and citizens of this country defend it in different ways. Second, law is a tool that can be used to legitimize oppression and fight oppression. So please do not adopt a law fetish, because it really is just a tool and it depends on who's got the power to use that tool. And then finally, In my view, American exceptionalism is arguably the biggest threat to our security because it causes us to neglect, ignore, or deny all of the different problems we have in our society, including our foreign policy abroad. Thank you.
So I'm going to moderate this discussion. Hopefully there'll be some questions from you. But just let me ask you something which I hope is a provocation. My work is on the costs of war. I'm an international relations scholar. I study war. And I'm just wondering, did we need to go abroad to prevent terrorist attacks? Or is what we did in the homeland sufficient? Was it worth it? Was it worth that? So this is sort of a question for Catherine, right? Did we prevent what we needed to prevent with the $1 trillion that we spent in Homeland Security in the last 20 years? And then I'm inviting you to also reflect on this question of democracy. All of you've raised democracy, talked about democracy. Is our democracy, I would say, has it been resilient? And when you talked, Sarah, about resistance, is that the sign of the health of democracy or a sign of, so we need to be more concerned? Okay, so those are my questions. And I'm also hoping that you guys all of you have questions. And I believe that there's a microphone that will come to you if you have a question. So would anybody like to take up my little provocations?
So since you addressed the first question to me, I think I'll give it a shot. You asked, is it worth it?
Mhm.
And I think that that's a very personal question for each individual to answer for themselves, as far as whether the cost of war is worth it or not. And it's what I talked about when I said that the pendulum will swing to reflect society. Folks, my position is that Congress and the federal bureaucracy, the huge institution that is the federal government, reflects society. That's what we're supposed to do. And I applaud my colleagues on the table who maybe have a little bit of a different perspective than I do for what they call resistance. I don't necessarily embrace the term resistance, but I appreciate their perspective and where it's coming from, because I think that's what makes our society great, is the fact that we can have the debate, that we can have the discussion that we're having here today, that we can ask ourselves questions like, was it worth it? I could stay here and you probably gathered from my perspective, I've spent a lot of time in the federal government. I've worked with the Army. I've worked with Veterans Affairs. I'm supportive of missions that harden our perimeter and protect our freedoms. So, that in some minds, puts me in a certain bucket, I'm sure. But I'm also really happy to report that within all the institutions that I've worked, this debate rages there as well. Don't think that everyone is monolithic that is in Congress or that is in the government and that has the same point of view. I can't speak as freely perhaps as my colleagues can, because I still work for the federal government. And so, I support the agenda of our current administration. I supported the agenda of our previous administration. And how do I reconcile that in my mind, going from very different administrations to administrations, is because the way I reconcile that personally is I feel that no matter what administration there is, it's the will of the people. It's the electorate that votes them in. So to the question that's posed to me is, was it worth it? I ask each and every one of you to answer that question of whether it was worth it. And we've given up a certain amount of our personal liberties, our privacy, our individual freedoms, we've bartered that for safety, or at least, or even maybe it's a perception of safety.
So Catherine, how many terrorist attacks were prevented by these measures, do you think?
Yeah,
Right.
I think a great deal, to be honest with you. I mean, and again,
but is there data on that?
There probably is data on that. I mean, I was, just being on the periphery. I don't claim to have been in the depths of it, but on the periphery of the intelligence activity that goes on, I know that there is intelligence activity that keeps us safe. I'm not at liberty to discuss it. I don't even have that degree of great familiarity, so I don't want to claim it. But I do feel, and maybe this is self-preservation given the career I've chosen, but I do feel that we are safer now than we were. I struggle as well with the question of whether it's worth it. Do the ends justify the means? That is something I think we all struggle with. But I do feel safer than I did, than we were on September 11th.
Okay, so I know that both Sarah and Sahar want to
ahead,
say
Sarah.
something.
Sure. I think, there's so much to say and I want to give time for Q&A, but I think just briefly, I think I'll respond to your other question about sort of the state of our democracy, which is sort of how I understood it. And I would build on something that Professor Aziz said, which I think is so precisely just well said, which is I think the biggest threat to democracy is American exceptionalism, right? Because American exceptionalism, allows us to ignore the brutality that we've carried out abroad and domestically. And that American exceptionalism has deep roots, right? Yesterday in my immigration law class, we read the Chinese Exclusion Act cases and the deeply racist imperialist language in those court decisions is you can see a direct through line from those cases to the Muslim ban cases. You can see a direct through line from those cases to family separation cases, and the lack of accountability that we've had in every one of those situations. I think it is not surprising that we are able to carry out the atrocious acts in the name of protecting our security and protecting our democracy. And there is no accountability, there are no consequences. And it should be no surprise to any of us that these things continue to happen, regardless of who the president is, regardless of who Congress is. It's because we believe we are better than. And I think that is extraordinarily dangerous.
Okay.
I just
Thank
want to
you.
quick.
Yeah.
So I'm going to be the devil's advocate vis-a-vis civil liberties advocates. So my community will probably critique me for minutes, but let's just do this thought exercise. Could we have prevented future terrorists? Right, the question that you asked, without going abroad. So I think that there needed to be a response to Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Osama bin Laden had free reign, unless we can prove that there was no causal connection between Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and 9/11, then I would argue that it was legitimate self-defense. But that's it. It's a very small military exercise. What I do not think is legitimate, both as a matter of policy, I don't think it's good policy, which is $1 trillion later, I think we finally admitted. But also I would argue, there's a legal debate on this, is whether or not we could have done what we did in Afghanistan under the doctrine of self-defense. We occupied that country. We took it over and we engaged in nation building. And that to me is, what happened in 9/11 doesn't justify that. What we needed to do is get rid of Al-Qaeda. Now, and again, this is me putting my hawk on. Iraq had nothing to do with it, with 9/11. So the last 20 years have not been about countering terrorism. Maybe 20 to 25% has been, but the vast majority of all our money and our time and our focus, the US government, has been to depose Saddam Hussein and complete what Dick Cheney wanted to do in 1990 when he begged Bush Sr. to continue the march past Kuwait into Baghdad. And Bush Sr. said, no, I'm not doing that. It was illegal. And it was also foolish for many reasons, which we now see in Iraq. And we want to weaken Iran and ideally control it. We want to weaken Syria, and we want to protect Israel. Those were the policy perspective. Those were the US foreign policy priorities in 2001 before 9/11. 9/11 provided that it was on a silver platter. It provided the opportunity to pursue many of these agendas. I'm not saying that 9/11 wasn't real. I'm not saying that it was. I'm saying that it was an opportunity that was exploited. Now, just with regard to the question about democracy, is the way I look at it, and as again somebody who's studying authoritarianism and always trying to understand how they are so resilient. The question is, what are the stakes and the price of dissent and political opposition? That's the question you want to ask yourself. If you want to dissent, or if you want to disagree, and I mean not just civilly, maybe you want to have a protest, right? Maybe you want to have a boycott, Maybe, let's say we're not going to accept violence. We're not going to get into insurgencies and let's just leave that aside. Do you go to jail? Do you get tortured? Do you lose your job? Do you become sick, lose your health? Because that's also something, once you lose your health, you're pretty much incapacitated. And that's the questions we should be asking. And as long as we can continue to engage in dissent and political opposition without losing at least our liberty and our health in terms of torture, and ideally not our jobs, our livelihood, then I think we're in a democratic system, and then it's just a work in progress. And it always will be a work in progress. There's no perfect system.
Thanks, great. There's a question here, and then I'm also gonna turn to the questions after that on the screen here from the online participants.
Hi, sorry, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
All right, so I just wanted to address one point. So you asked how many terrorist attacks have been stopped since 2000. I don't think that's a number that's even possible to find, unfortunately, just because you can't really quantify that. But I was looking and I found two different statistics. Mind if I bring my computer up so she could take a look at them?
No, why don't you just stay there and make your point,
So,
because I actually know the number that they
If we
claim.
look
So,
at 2001, there were a total of 40 attacks. This is brought to you by Washington Post. 10 or so fatal, give or take. So if we keep going down to 2011, where is the last statistic that it leaves at, there were 10 number of attacks and 0 deaths. It's also a constant downtrend. So I believe since 2001, since we're on a constant downtrend of fatal and non-fatal attacks, it has been working.
great.
Yep.
Okay.
And I also had one other question. So how do you get on a terrorist watch list exactly? if there's like any way to explain that.
That's a great
Sorry, I
question.
just didn't know.
Do you want me to answer that?
Just go ahead, yeah.
Okay, so there's something called the Terrorist Screening Center that was created in 2003. And it is a very, if you Google it, you'll see a big chart. It's a very convoluted chart, but you get nominated by different agencies, and it is supposed to be internally vetted. Ultimately, the TSC is controlled within the FBI. And there are different levels. The problem is it's all secret, so there's no transparency, and there's no due process. There isn't someone representing that individual to be able to say, well, let me see the evidence that justifies they should be on a terrorist watch list, and here's some rebuttal evidence to show that they shouldn't be on the watch list, right? But ultimately, it is an internal interagency nomination process.
So do you want to say something about this? No, I'm actually.
No, I thought her.
Okay, all right, because you've been there.
I've been there, yeah.
You've been there. Okay. Why don't we actually hang on to you for a minute? There are a couple other people who had questions. And then maybe we can follow up later. So there is this question. Thank you for your insightful remarks, Sahar. It seems that it has become much more difficult to gain citizenship for brown immigrants since 9/11. Do statistics exist on the relative ease of the path to citizenship for Middle Eastern immigrants in the past 20 years? I think actually all of you could answer this.
Yeah, so I don't have the statistics at the ready. I can speak anecdotally about my own work in the clinic here. We represent non-citizens who are facing deportation. We represent folks who are asylum seekers, refugees, folks in detention, and folks pursuing lawful immigration status. And I can say, and again, this is anecdotal, so, but I can say in my own experience and based on the experiences of my colleagues, and there's a large network of immigrant service providers in the Boston area and greater New England, that we do see increased vetting, or what we might call, increased vetting for Arab, Muslim, South Asian, and Middle Eastern immigrants that are seeking relief and status in the United States. And these include folks who have escaped horrific, persecution, torture, and trauma in their home countries, being asked to jump through all number of hoops to prove that they are not terrorists, to prove that they don't have associations with terrorist entities. Like Professor Aziz was saying, and as I alluded to earlier, there's this material support bar that has been increasingly wielded as a weapon against certain immigrant groups in particular. And I would just say that I want to just make a quick note about the database that Professor Aziz was speaking to and that you spoke to. These kinds of databases are increasingly being used to vet all kinds of people. And as with many things, it starts with non-citizens and then it comes home, so to speak, right? So we're seeing it being used against non-citizens, but we're also seeing these fusion centers pop up that track information about suspected gang involvement, about suspected criminal activity, about suspected terrorist activity. And just like the terrorist watch list, once you're in, it's almost impossible to get out. And it's also very unclear why and how people get in. So these kinds of, just to say sort of writ large, these increased vetting regimes, I think, are deeply problematic and deeply flawed. And the short answer is yes. It seems like it has gotten much harder, but I'll let others chime in.
Oh, I'm happy to. Yeah. So I think you have to separate it into at least 4 different categories. The first is the deportation. And we saw certainly in the first 5 years, I haven't been keeping up with the data and I haven't seen any headline news anyway about it, that for the first 5 years, there was a very explicit targeting of people whose national origins were from Muslim majority countries who were out of status. The reality is the government DHS doesn't have the resources to deport everybody who's out of status because there are 11 million people out of status that are undocumented. And so they, like police officers, decide how to use their resources for enforcement. And that in those first 5 years, Ashcroft was very clear. We're going after people from these countries because we think that they're more subject to being terrorists because of their religion and national identity. The second is visa applications. There's plenty you can find online that shows that the number of visa applications of people who want to come, especially for visitor visas. I'm not so sure about the student visas were also being denied for a certain period, but thanks to the lobbyists for colleges and universities who make quite a bit of revenue from international students, they actually pushed to fix that, which was to stop denying student visas for people from Muslim majority countries. But yeah, the numbers were very low. Then you have the very serious problem of naturalization applications. And that's where I would recommend you go check out the ACLU of Southern California. They did a great report on something called CARP, which I don't remember what it stands for, but it's effectively this system, this program that DHS put together that looks for any national security grounds to deny naturalization. So these are people who have lived here for at least 5 years and oftentimes for decades who want to become citizens. And it's no coincidence that everybody who's being denied according to CARP or whose applications are languishing are all from Muslim majority countries. And then finally, the refugee limitations, which Trump put on full display, but there's a tremendous amount of discretion, right, that DHS has in everything it does because of the plenary authority, within immigration legal doctrine, but not accepting as many, if any, refugees from conflict zones in Muslim majority countries. So the answer is yes.
Okay. All right, then I see a hand in the back. Gary?
I'm just curious, if I recall correctly, Catherine, you had been involved in setting up the Office of Civil Rights at DHS.
Mhm.
And if I heard correctly, Sahar, you also have worked in that office. And I'm curious about how an office like that operates within the Department of Homeland Security and works with the different elements of the agency to oversee civil rights or to protect civil rights.
Sure, and the professor can probably answer more from her personal experience working in the office, but I was there very early on in the setting up of the office before the first officer for civil rights and civil liberties was even appointed. That individual is Daniel Sutherland, a good friend of mine. But before he was even appointed, part of my responsibilities was to set the office up, meaning establish a directive that operates within the department on how that office would operate, how it would interact with other offices in the department. There was an MOU, a memorandum of agreement or understanding negotiated with that office and the inspector general within the department on what their roles and responsibilities would be. There was also a memorandum of agreement negotiated between that office and my office, the Office of General Counsel, to clarify our roles and what level of legal support we would provide. Because I think from the very beginning, what Congress intended and what we tried to implement was that office would operate somewhat semi-autonomously, meaning that it should have its own lawyers, for instance, that would be, and that the professor was clearly one of those, that would provide, somewhat independent advice. So it wouldn't be getting advice from the same lawyers that were more focused on some of the enforcement aspects, perhaps, that the department was doing it. And I think all very lofty goals. And we tried to establish it institutionally so that it would operate as freely as it would in order to influence the policies that were going to be in tension with some other policies that the department was operating. Fully understanding that. I mean, our whole country is based upon tensions, I think, the whole way our democracy is organized, and also within our federal government and within the Department of Homeland Security, by establishing, and I know, maybe it hasn't operated perfectly, but the mere fact that Congress chose to establish an officer for civil rights and civil liberties and chose to install a privacy office within the Department of Homeland Security, I thought was very positive and very significant. I come from Japanese heritage, and I can remember as a young child going to the Museum of American History and seeing all the anti-Japanese propaganda that occurred in the wake of World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and really being struck. I mean, I was born in this nation, but my mother was born in Japan. My father met her during the occupation, and being struck at a very visceral level at how my mere appearance could have caused me to be interred if I had been born in a different era. And so after the attacks of 9/11, I kind of really started thinking between the year that occurred about how important it was that even as I was so supportive of hardening our perimeter and protecting our nation from threats, that it was also important to remember the civil rights and civil liberties that those that came within. But I know the professor can speak more about maybe the reality of how our initial efforts unfolded.
Yeah. So Dan Sutherland hired me, actually. He was, I worked for him when he was the head, and then he transitioned out due to the political appointment process. But I will tell you that the Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties is a well-intentioned project. It still exists. If I put my academic hat on, I will say that there is always the risk that when you have self-regulation within entities that are often accused of violating civil rights and civil liberties, you have a higher risk of capture, right, by those divisions. And that's a structural problem. And I certainly saw it when I was working there, because oftentimes you don't, you don't want TSA and CBP and ICE to, you want to have a good working relationship with them, because they're your repeat players, and there's a lot of interaction and engagement, and sometimes it's about something that's very controversial and sometimes it's not. And when you go to them and say, I want all the data on the race, ethnicity, and gender of the people that are being secondarily screened at airports because we've received allegations that there's racial or religious profiling, they don't give it to you, because they don't. First, I mean, well, I shouldn't make that blanket statement. I should say that they're not eager to give it to you. And oftentimes they don't know, are you trying to play gotcha? Or are you going to embarrass them? What are you going to do with that information? And I've said this publicly many times, especially after I was finished with my job there, was you need subpoena power. We didn't have subpoena power. We couldn't force their hand. It was all based on cooperation and collaboration, which, and you may be familiar with the saying, but I was told that whoever has the guns in the different agencies are the most powerful people within that agency, and that would be ICE and TSA, who are often the people who most of the complaints were against by private citizens. So it's, again, and if you really want to go purely kind of academic and abstract, as you could argue, we shouldn't even have these internal Office for Civil Rights, because they create the impression to the public that, don't worry, you don't need to be on guard. You don't need to watchdog us, because we've got this office. And so it's a form of placating the public and then not having that accountability and that external watchdog that I think is necessary to keep our democracy going. But that's a very controversial statement, I know, and I know it's comes from a position of being an academic, but it is something to think about if you're going to make policy recommendations, as students, is sometimes it might be better not to have these civil rights offices, but then you need an alternative externally that will play that role. Because if you have nothing, it's better to have the office.
So I think, am I correct that we've reached our hour, in fact, exceeded it? So thank you so much, everyone, for your remarks. questions. And there was one question we didn't get to online, which was what the racial paradox is, but perhaps,
I'll just pitch my book.
yeah, perhaps we'll pitch
The
the
Racial
book.
Muslim.
Okay,
It's available for.
so
purchase.
sorry about that. Thank you, everyone.
And next week, we're having a book symposium about.
Oh,
All right, book symposium next week. Be here,
thank you.
be there or be square.
And thank you, Professor Crawford.
Yeah, thank you,
Thank
Professor
Thank you
Crawford.
so much.